From the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power alongside Kayleigh Lines. I'm Joe Matthew. And welcome to day 2 of the Republican National Convention. Kayleigh, J.D. Vance looming large in the hall last night, and we've got some interesting speakers, including Donald Trump's former opponent, Nikki Haley, we'll be hearing from later today.
Yeah, of course, a late addition to the convention schedule. Trump extending the invitation over this past weekend in the aftermath of the attempted assassination on him in Pennsylvania on Saturday. And this, of course, comes as we're all bracing for all of the speakers, frankly, to be speaking differently than they may have before that event occurred, which is a message of unity and perhaps bringing in Nikki Haley. And I'm sure the aim is to bring in the primary voters who chose her over Donald Trump during the course of the primary campaign into the fold. Reports as well, Ron DeSantis could be speaking. This is an interesting thing to watch evolve here as the Republican Party and this RNC try to harness unity following this assassination attempt on Saturday, Kayleigh. Yeah, and of course, the conversation we were all having yesterday prior to the selection of J.D. Vance as the vice presidential nominee was whether or not, in the spirit of unity, Trump might go for someone a little less intense with the rhetoric, shall we say, less of a bulldog. And instead, perhaps the decision was you get the bulldog to fight for you so that you yourself can speak unity. Interesting. We're going to watch this unfold in real time together with Bloomberg's best, Laura Davison and Gregory Cordy joining us here at the table. Welcome to day 2. It's great to have you both here. Laura, what are we in for in today's session?
So tonight is the second night. The theme is all about Make America Safe Again. So last night was all about the economy. Tonight is going to be about crime, border, immigration, a lineup of speakers. Most interesting, perhaps, is Nikki Haley, this late add to the schedule. What I'm really watching for is what is the reaction in the room? When Mitch McConnell came onto the floor yesterday, he was booed. Wow. It is possible that Nikki Haley also has a chilly reception. The Republicans that are here are not necessarily her wing of the party. This is very much a Trump crowd, and so that could create, put a little cast of shadow over the party unity message that they're at least trying to project forward.
Well, Nikki Haley, of course, prior to the convention, released the delegates that she did win during the primary process and encouraged them to vote for Donald Trump. When she dropped out of the campaign, though, all the way back in March, she did not encourage those who voted for her to do the same. She said Donald Trump needed to earn those votes. Do you expect, Gregory, we might hear differently from her tonight, a suggestion perhaps that those votes have been earned?
You know, it's remarkable to think about how we've gotten to this point where a year ago we were talking about a dozen different candidates in the Republican Party all challenging Donald Trump for the nomination. Some making the point a little more strongly than others that Trump was disqualified from the presidency. I remember Asa Hutchinson, Chris Christie, Nikki Haley became more aggressive on that line of attack as things went on. But most of the field was basically auditioning for what we have seen now, the Veep stakes and cabinet posts. But it is remarkable how much this party has unified around Trump. And of course, the events of last weekend, I think, have only contributed to that momentum, that this is a party, you feel it on the floor of this convention. This is a party that's very much united around Trump. Not that they weren't before, but there's a real feeling, not just of unity, but of solidarity. And it's not an angry convention like maybe the 2016 convention was. It's unified in a more optimistic way. It's just the sense I'm getting from this convention.
Well, that's something. I'd love to hear from both of you about the issues where these two overlap, and in some cases not. But when it comes to foreign policy, J.D. Vance talked last night on Fox News about his views. Here he is.
I think what President Trump has promised to do is go in there, negotiate with the Russians and Ukrainians, bring this thing to a rapid close so that America can focus on the real issue, which is China. That's the biggest threat for our country, and we're completely distracted from it.
To key off of this, Laura, what happens to the war in Ukraine if Trump, Vance win?
So the thing that's important to remember is that, especially as vice president, he has less say over some of things like funding the war in Ukraine than he did as a senator. He's able to hold up those bills directly. But if Trump wins the presidency, Ukraine hope for additional funding, all but disappears. Especially if Republicans take both chambers, you can pretty much take that off the table as an issue in Washington. Vance is very much cut from the same cloth as Trump, saying, look, I don't want to be involved in these wars. I don't want to focus on the Russia-Ukraine border. I want to focus on the U.S.-Mexico border.
He's a veteran speaking.
He is, which is a real, this is really out of step where his colleagues in the Senate are on this issue. Yeah. He's really an outlier there.
Okay, so Trump and Vance obviously are aligned in their isolationist bent, if you will, the populist bent. And Vance is literally half the age of Donald Trump at this point. Trump is 78, Vance is 39. So the question we also have is not just the implications for, say, 2025 through 2029, assuming that this ticket wins, but beyond that, if Vance then is a contender in 2028, if he is indeed vice president, might make him the most likely to win the Republican nomination. Obviously, none of us know what happened, but is this essentially the solidifying of a MAGA Republican Party that is going to live well beyond Donald Trump?
Yeah, the two most disappointed people in Milwaukee yesterday were probably Doug Burgum and Marco Rubio, who were also sort of at the top of the short list for VP. The third most disappointed person has to be Ron DeSantis, because Vance has now been tapped as the de facto heir apparent. Now, Trump hasn't said anything about that. Obviously, we're a long way from 2028. But in the natural course of things, you would have to think that this would give Vance a considerable leg up to be the future of the party if he wants to be that. And of course, every politician does. That every the congressman wants to be a senator, and every senator wants to be president. So absolutely, I in terms of the ideological daylight between them, I don't think there's much. But even if there is, vice presidents tend to subsume the policies of their president. In the long term, I think Vance, very crypto friendly, obviously very tech friendly. These are policy areas where Trump hasn't been particularly attuned to in the past. Yeah. And this rounds out the ticket a little bit in some policy areas that Vance has the expertise on.
Well, I wonder if they bump into each other on some issues as well, like raising the minimum wage or antitrust. For what it's worth, we're probably making too big of a deal out of a running mate selection here. The long-term implications are important, Gregory. But to the extent that it's going to impact Donald Trump's view on these issues, should we be paying attention?
I think the biggest interesting thing to watch is the divide between big tech, which Vance has said he wants to break up, the Amazons, the Googles, all of these. He's teamed up with Elizabeth Warren on that. As little tech. Little tech is the world that Vance comes from, startups, these earlier stage companies
so
where he wants to cut
in the middle here?
It's very possible. Or you could see sort of a dividing line there of, cutting regulations for small companies while, on the other hand, going after some of these bigger, more established tech companies.
All right. Laura Davison and Gregory Cordy here with us in Milwaukee. Thank you so much as we assess what the selection of vice presidential nominee and Senator J.D. Vance ultimately means. And this is something we spoke about yesterday with Governor Brian Kemp of Georgia. We asked for his reaction to Donald Trump's choice of Vance here and what ultimately it means for swing states especially. And this is what he said.
Look, I think it's a good pick for President Trump. I mean, Senator Vance brings an element of youth to this race that we haven't seen, that's for sure. The guy's a United States Senator, obviously qualified to serve. Great messenger, which is, I think, very important when you think about what's going to be going on the next 4 or 5 months in this campaign.
Well, as we consider this selection, though, knowing that you represent one of the key swing states we are watching in this cycle, knowing Georgia is not bright red or bright blue, what does J.D. Vance bring to undecided voters in Georgia? How is he likely to influence that opinion when he, as we've talked about, may just be seen as a younger version of Donald Trump himself?
Well, I think it's not just what J.D. Vance brings to the race, but also what President Trump and other Republicans can do between now and November to make sure that, you're getting those persuadable voters. For me, and what I'm hearing every day is that Americans and Georgians can't afford another 4 years of Joe Biden. I think that is a message that J.D. Vance can deliver. It's certainly a message that President Trump and a lot of other Republicans, whether it be, people that we're trying to help win at the state House and state Senate level to hold our majorities in the General Assembly in Georgia, are going to be talking about people.
That was part of our interview with Georgia Governor Brian Kemp yesterday, and we continue to push forward on this day 2 of the Republican convention now that J.D. Vance is Donald Trump's running mate, and especially traders are watching to see what this ticket actually means for the U.S. economy and policy that will affect financial markets going forward. Chen is with us now here in Milwaukee. He is a Hoover Institution fellow, also former policy director for the Romney-Ryan campaign back in 2012. I'd like to begin, Lanhee, by asking you something I was just talking about with our colleague Gregory Cordy, this idea that the Romney Republican Party, the Romney-Ryan ticket of 2012 is very much not a Trump-Vance ticket of 2024. And now that we have a selection of a 39-year-old vice presidential nominee who could lead the party forward in this direction for many years to come, is this the end of that Romney Republican Party?
Look, clearly contrast in style as well as substance. I would hesitate to say it's the end because you still have some members of Congress, I think, who reflect a different point of view. I think we're in a transitional period. And the Republican Party has changed from being a party, country club Republicans, corporate Republicans, whatever you want to call them, to a party that's more working class and more populist, both in terms of definitionally how it transcends, how it transacts its politics, but also policy. And you're seeing the populist edges of that in this Trump-Vance ticket. So I don't necessarily think that the party of old is dead. I do think that it is a different party and it continues to become a different party. There may be a point at which that's true, but for now at least, I think there is still some influence of these more traditional points of view on the party.
Well, do you worry that this economic populism, some call isolationism, is dangerous for the party, for the country?
Well, I think there's some areas in which that the policy prescriptions are not quite what I would advocate for. So we're going to have a big discussion over tax reform next year with the expiration of provisions in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And I think there will be a very real discussion, for example, around the corporate tax rate. This is one area where I think where I think the sort of Trump-Vance view of the world, maybe more the Vance view of the world, differs from what we might expect traditional Republicans to argue for. In a large tax reform package, it would not surprise me to see the corporate tax rate move in a direction opposite than what we saw in the 2017 round of reform, just because the premium is going to be placed on individual tax reform. And given the deficit and debt posture we have, I have a really difficult time seeing that tax cut being completely unpaid for. So I do think that there are ways in which we are going to see some differences beginning to develop.
Well, to the point our colleague Laura was making, when it comes to, say, the tax conversation, that ultimately is one that has to originate in Congress just to be signed by President whomever. Does J.D. Vance have less power to influence that as vice president than he would as a United States senator?
Oh, I don't think so at all. Even though the conversation on tax in particular will start in the House, the vice president, particularly if, let's say, a future President Trump empowers his vice president to be on point on these things, he will have a tremendous amount of influence over where this conversation goes. And given how divided and fractured the Congress is, how much we're seeing expertise leaving the Congress with long-term members of Congress who have experience in tax and economic policy leaving, it does place a premium on leadership from the executive branch, in my view. So I actually think that J.D. Vance is in a terrific position to influence policy, whether it's economic policy or any of the other areas he's interested in.
Deficits ballooned under the Trump administration, and you'll then tell me that they ballooned more under the Biden administration. But are we going to do it all over again under Trump 2.0?
It doesn't seem like a lot of the constraints are there anymore. The political constraints have departed, right? I mean, there used to be some in our politics who were arguing in favor of fiscal discipline and talking about the value of entitlement reform. That conversation seems to be off the table. So I do fear that in the short to intermediate run, we are looking at a situation where fiscal constraints have been lifted, and there is very little to constrain spending, whether of the tax expenditure variety or direct spending, or even bolstering of entitlement programs. So we're in a very different world now than we were in 2012 when I was helping the Romney-Ryan ticket.
Well, we're in a different world in a lot of ways, including conflict that is outbroken in multiple theaters, including, of course, the war in Ukraine, which J.D. Vance has not expressed support for continuing to fund. In fact, when he was on Fox News last night, we played a little bit earlier in the program, this idea that he was like, we need to focus on China. Forget about the conflict in Ukraine. China, he said, is the biggest threat facing the United States. I ask you this as the son of immigrants from Taiwan. Do you agree with that sentiment? What should we expect to see when it comes to China policy from this ticket? First
of all, I would hope as the greatest country on earth, we could walk and chew gum at the same time, meaning that we could attend to both of these really significant issues. There is no question, though, Senator Vance is absolutely right, that China is the single biggest foreign policy and national security issue that we have to face over the next several years. I think if this administration continues some of the policy work we saw in the first Trump administration, we'll be in very good stead. I think one of the areas where I believe the Biden administration has really let down the American people is in having a more coherent set of strategic goals around our engagement with China, or lack thereof. So I do think that what this potential Trump administration will bring I would hope, is a more coherent perspective on where are we trying to get to with China? What's the eventual goal? And that also implicates issues like Taiwan, specifically human rights, if that's going to be an issue. And then most importantly, probably for the audience here, trade and economic issues.
Nikki Haley is speaking tonight at the convention. I suspect you might be in the hall. Will she channel Mitt Romney or Donald Trump?
I think she'll channel Nikki Haley.
Yeah.
I mean, she's managed to
navigate.
where
I'm going here.
Yeah, no, I understand. But here's the thing. She has the capacity to help unite the Republican Party. By the way, the Republican Party is the most united I've seen it in a while around candidate and former President Trump. But I think Nikki Haley has the potential to speak to maybe that small sliver that's still disaffected. But she goes beyond that. She speaks to independents. She speaks to people who haven't made a decision in this election yet. And I think she's got a tremendous ability to speak to all of the issues we've talked about. I mean, seeing her as a presidential candidate up close during that election that we've just had, she's a very skilled communicator and potentially a very great asset to the Trump-Vance ticket.
Of course, she might be a little bit disappointed herself as she considers 2028 now that J.D. Vance has been the vice presidential
a lifetime away.
Nominee. Surely it is. And as we've learned in recent days, literally anything possible can happen. And on that note, after the attempted assassination last weekend on Donald Trump, he has said himself he is reworking the speech he will give on Thursday, that he wants to focus on unity. I guess my question to you would be, knowing and having watched Donald Trump for all these years now, do you believe that unity message can actually stick for the next 3.5 months?
We'll see if it does or not. I mean, I think politicians tend to sort of go back to form pretty often and in a comfort spot. But Donald Trump's not a typical politician, right? So he very well could. He very well could. Not unusual, by the way, for a convention speech to be reworked up until the end. I mean, so it doesn't surprise me that they're still looking at what to do with it. But he has an opportunity, if he continues on this theme, to truly move the country forward, and I think to gain the support of people who may have been skeptical of him before. So I think the political opportunity is irresistible. If you think about the ways in which they might position this speech or think about what the speech can do. So I don't want to make any predictions. I'm not part of the process, but we'll see what happens.
Great conversation.
Thank you.
Great to spend some time with you here at the convention. Lanhee, Chen, we thank you for being with us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kayleigh Lyons with much more to follow. Coming up, our conversation with Senator Bill Hagerty of Tennessee. It's coming up next on a special Balance of Power on Bloomberg, live from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. We're live in Milwaukee at the Republican National Convention. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kayleigh Lyons with some new polling out today. YouGov and VCU's latest polls show Donald Trump leading President Biden in Virginia, and to that extent, in all 7 of the swing states that we've been talking about at length here that we feature in our own polling. 2 to 7 points for Donald Trump in these states, Kayleigh.
Yeah, there is not a single swing state, according to the YouGov polling, that Joe Biden is winning right now, which is pretty incredible. But of course, the conversation we continue to have is whether or not that list may actually be expanding. We've been thinking about it as 7, but is it potentially 8 or more? It's not just Virginia we're paying attention to. Arguably, you could say the same about Minnesota if you're listening to the Trump campaign. There's even been questions about New York. And now that we know who is joining Donald Trump on the ticket, and we still believe Joe Biden to be the Democratic nominee, that he is going to push forward in that way. The question is, do you actually start to see that showing up in polling in a more material way?
Yeah, does the map start to morph? Let's assemble our panel. Rick Davis from Stonecourt Capital is with us, and Jeanne Zaino of Iona University, Bloomberg Politics contributors, to talk about these latest numbers and what's coming up next here at this Republican National Convention. What's your thought on this, Rick? I know that you're a critic of national polls, but we have some important swing state numbers here. Do you believe the map is being shaken up?
Yeah, I think the map is pretty solid, right? I mean, not much has moved really for the last year. It's plus or minus the margin of error in almost every one of these states. Some are closer than others. There's no question that there's a appreciative deterioration of Biden's numbers since the debate. There's no question that some of his base, especially young black men, are starting to move over. What was particularly interesting to me in this Virginia poll, the VCU poll, was that Biden has really lost support amongst black voters. I mean, he was at the last poll 67% black support, and now he's down at, in the mid 40s. That is a big chunk of your base coming right off.
Yeah. We should note about the VCU poll, just so our viewers and listeners are informed on all the information. This poll was conducted between June 24th and July 3rd. So for at least part of it, the debate had not yet happened. So we also have to consider that aspect of it. Potentially, you could argue that may have made it more favorable to Biden than it otherwise would have been. Jeanne, on the YouGov polling, though, what's so fascinating is obviously we know that Joe Biden has been struggling more in the Sun Belt. That is borne out in the polling of those states. Arizona, there is a 7-point gulf between Trump and Biden. But Pennsylvania, 3-point difference, obviously in favor of Trump, 2 points in favor of Trump in Michigan, yes, within the margin of error. But the conversation we're having around J.D. Vance is that in the Rust Belt, in those exact states, that may be where his appeal is greatest. So if you're the Biden campaign, are you kind of freaking out about that right now?
These are not good numbers. Let me just try to be a little bit more positive, though. We are 4 months out, and
Sure.
the 7 states they polled, 2 are outside of the margin of error. But to everybody's point, these are not the numbers you want to see if you are the Biden campaign. The pick of J.D. Vance, the Republicans feel that maybe that does help them take or pick up in states like Michigan, Wisconsin. Obviously, they already win Ohio and Pennsylvania. So that is troubling. I would just say that for the Biden team, these are the darkest times that we have seen in an election, to Rick's point, that has been otherwise, politically stable. And I go back to Doug Sosnick's great piece where he looked at these numbers and he said, right now, it looks like if the election were held today, Donald Trump could have the biggest electoral victory since 2008. Sorry, Rick, I'm sorry to say that. So those are very, very troubling times. And we don't see many signs of it getting better. But again, we are 4 months out. But these certainly are not the numbers the Biden team needs to see or wants to see. That's why they had the debate early. They wanted to shake it up. And theoretically, maybe it got shook up in the wrong direction. We don't know yet because we haven't seen a lot of polling.
Crime and immigration, the themes on this second day of the RNC. And Rick, we're going to get a primetime address from Nikki Haley, which is going to be interesting. I'll try to qualify that as primetime. We'll see what the actual timing is on this. We've been talking until you joined us here about this push and pull between the old line Republican Party and what is now MAGA. She's the closest thing to the old GOP we're going to probably hear from this week. What's she going to say?
Yeah, look, I think what she said on the stump is predictable of what she'll say tonight. One, probably focus on foreign policy, even though tonight's theme is security, as you point out. I think she'll brandish her credentials as a internationalist. It won't sound so protectionist as what you'll probably hear from other Trump supporters who are going to be on the podium. She'll protect her image by, being true to her views. And so I would suspect, as we've been talking all week, the one unifier within the party and even with Democrats is China. So I suspect she'll take a swing at the Chinese and what's going on in the South China Sea right now, which is almost at critical levels. And probably just a little bit of domestic politics to check the box for the Trump folks. So, but you're right. I mean, I think a lot of people up until yesterday thought of her as maybe she's still the future of the Republican Party. Trump's not going to be running after this term if he is elected. And when J.D. Vance was put on the ticket, I think that dashed the hopes of most of the Haley people to think that there's a real future in it for her now. Yeah. So.
Well, when Haley dropped out of the race after Super Tuesday, she specifically said it was up to Donald Trump to earn the votes of those that voted for her during the primary process. Does he earn any of those votes with the selection of J.D. Vance?
With the selection of J.D. Vance, absolutely not. I mean, and I would contend that even him on the ticket isn't really addressing the Rust Belt strategy they have, because they have to win suburbs, and his rhetoric is not sort of tailor-made for that. He's great on working-class rural voters, but they've kind of gotten all they're going to get out of that turnip. So it'll be interesting to see how they modulate him in his speech, J.D. Vance's speech on Wednesday night. Does he do more to reach out to those swing voters in suburbs.
What does it tell us if Nikki Haley is booed tonight, and how should she respond?
You know, it was fascinating to me. If you guys read the piece in The Atlantic by Tim Alberta of the two Trump campaign managers, they almost said specifically, they are not half that interested in those women suburban voters. They are digging down on the MAGA crowd. They are digging down on the future of the party, which they believe is Donald Trump. Hence the pick, I think, of J.D. Vance. I think there's a possibility she could get booed. I don't know what will happen there. But I think this is telling about where the Republican Party is headed. They want young men, Latino, Black. They want them to come out on the basis of their frustration with foreign aid, on their basis of frustration with the economy, on their basis of frustration with a government they feel doesn't work. And they are really doubling down on that. And so I'm not sure Nikki Haley is the future of the party that, you know, I think I even said in New Hampshire she might be. Probably just hoping.
New Hampshire feels like 85 million years ago in many ways. We've been talking, obviously, at the executive level about presidential politics as we're at this convention. But especially when we look at the YouGov polling, we were just talking about Trump and Biden. Yes, interesting. What's also interesting is they also looked at the Senate races in these same swing states. Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. In each state, the Democratic candidate is running ahead of Biden and leading their Republican opponent by a margin of at least 7 points. So as we have this conversation about whatever Trump and Vance could do, if they ultimately win in November, Congress has to play a role in that too. And in the congressional sense, is it looking as promising for the Republicans that are gathered here in Milwaukee?
It is not. And I think that's one of our big questions. Does the top of the ticket determine what happens in those congressional races? Do people split their vote? And this is one of the reasons Democrats are calling for Joe Biden to step aside, because the Democratic candidates are overperforming. They have been, and they feel that some of them, I shouldn't say all, they are being dragged down by the top of this ticket. If there was a change, maybe they could flourish, if you will, and hold that Senate. So I think this is one of the big stories we're going to be watching.
We're going to be hearing from Ron DeSantis as well, who at one point I don't think was even invited to the convention. Now he's on the speaking program. Rick, is this the most disappointing week since he dropped out of the race for him?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I hadn't actually thought about his state of mind walking into a convention that he had hoped would be speaking Thursday night, not Tuesday night.
And potentially writing off 2028.
And I'm sure writing off 2028. I think the message was very clear from the Trump campaign yesterday. We are investing in J.D. Vance. They even said he's the future of the MAGA movement. Yeah. And so there's no pretending anymore that he isn't going to get, unless something bad goes wrong, Trump doesn't win the election and it's all, fair game for 2028. Yes. But within the party, that's all eyes are on him. So the fact that DeSantis comes in and has a Tuesday night slot, it's got to be a disappointment. But at the end of the day, he'll be in front of a huge crowd. He's got a great chance to impress delegates. This is how you generate a future political option by overperforming. And he's got a pretty high bar to jump over. No short jokes included in that.
I'll leave that there. Rick, just on the subject of Ron DeSantis, after his pretty precipitous decline in the Republican primary, where initially we did think he may have a chance of being the nominee, and then after Iowa, we all know what happened. The conversation we were having at that point was perhaps Donald Trump's politics only work when it is Donald Trump who is trying to run on them. Is it different for J.D. Vance? Can he do what Ron DeSantis could not in trying to adopt MAGA but not being the MAGA man himself?
Yeah, when J.D. Vance got elected, he was not MAGA. Yeah. And so the transformation is complete, right? I mean, this is not Star Wars, but it's close. And the reality is he is just as MAGA as Donald Trump. I mean, sometimes you put a candidate on the ticket to make the convention happy and fire up your troops. That's exactly what they did yesterday. There's nobody in that crowd who doesn't think that J.D. Vance is just as MAGA as Donald Trump. And I think J.D. Vance may have, if they win, 4 years to practice, I think, the stage management of MAGA, which Donald Trump not only invented, but took to a totally different level.
Look at the issues, though, as we've been discussing. J.D. Vance is concerned about antitrust. He wants a higher minimum wage. Should Joe Biden start talking about J.D. Vance's Democratic-leaning ideas in some of those cases?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes he's, holding hands practically with somebody like Elizabeth Warren.
Well, that's right.
Yeah, and so it is fascinating. I think it's part of his populist appeal, if you will. But I want to remind everybody that in the last election, his first for Senate, which he won by 6 points, he underperformed everyone else in Ohio. And there has been some really good reporting on that. And some people have argued, and we have to look at the data, some of that may be a result of some of his positions. And I go back to his very strict views on abortion. He doesn't want to open up for exceptions of people who are victimized by rape and incest. That is a very hard sell. So yes, on the financial piece, is this populist leaning, but he has also embraced this MAGA. Kaylee, I'm going to steal your MAGA man. Did you make that up? That's wonderful.
I may have. I'm not sure. I'm sure someone else has used that before.
But it's a good one because it does describe who he is. And I think that that's going to make, he hasn't been tested on the national level. The vice presidential pick may not matter as much at that stage, but I love you're talking about 28. If he's going to go up there, that's a whole nother ballgame. Yeah.
Well, as we have the conversation about J.D. Vance's economic policy ideas, and Rick, to what you were just saying about he's going to have 4 years to kind of mold himself more into the likes of Donald Trump, is it not far more likely that J.D. Vance becomes more like Donald Trump, including in his ideas around some of these things, be it competition or even higher taxes for people of higher income, than it is that Donald Trump is influenced by the ideas of J.D. Vance?
No question. I mean, J.D. is pretty much there on all things. And by the way, he will now adopt Donald Trump's position, as ambiguous as it is, on abortion, right? There's no such thing as a J.D. Vance point of view between now and the election. They have to be completely in sync. And if they're lucky enough to get elected, there will never be daylight between Donald Trump and J.D. Vance on an issue. So he will come out of this administration, if they're elected, a carbon copy of Donald Trump.
Okay. So maybe the Trump trade that everybody has been talking about rhetorically on Wall Street is also the Vance trade, if you're thinking about it in that sense. But
the Vance trade.
It doesn't have the same alliterative effect.
A big deal about a running mate being announced, have we?
No. Has been exciting, though. And Rick Davis of Stonecourt Capital and Jeanne Zaino of Iona University are here with us through this, of course. They'll be back with us later on in the program. First, though, let's see what's happening in those financial markets. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle is joining us with a look at the latest. Abigail?
Well, Kelly, we were just talking about that Trump trade, or maybe the Vance trade. Let's take a look at it, because there has been some sense that it is on the decline today. That's because DJT, or Trump Media and Entertainment's, down about 9%. But I would argue beneath the surface, it's alive, kicking, and very well. Over the last 2 days, DJT up more than 20%. The Trump trade essentially is a quick way of seeing what markets think is the former president, Donald Trump. Will he be reelected? And given all of the green on the screen relative to sectors and stocks that could do well under his overall policies, let's just abbreviate that by saying protectionism, economic populism. We have trains higher, shown by Old Dominion. We have trucking higher, JB Hunt up another day. We also have private prisons higher, private education. In fact, Chegg soaring up 14.3%, Morgan Stanley giving a nod of approval. And this whole Trump trade, of course, was really boosted after the assassination attempt over the weekend, Donald Trump's resilient response to it. The broader point here, though, is certainty. Investors want certainty. So going into the debate a few weeks ago, there was basically a 5% betting odd. Now, according to PredictIt, Donald Trump has a 69% chance of being reelected. Joe Biden, the current president, of course, is at 28%. That is a huge spread. And after the debate, talk of Kamala, she's at 10% right now. So clearly the money, it is going with former President Trump. And that's also the case if we follow the money relative to the most highly taxed companies in the world on an absolute basis. Over the last month, or roughly since that debate, you have Apple, Microsoft, Berkshire Hathaway, along with ExxonMobil, all solidly higher. Again, Kaylee, suggesting that the Trump trade is doing quite well in a vote in some ways from the markets for the former president.
All right, Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle with a look at those markets. Thank you so much. In New York, of course, well, we're here in Milwaukee, and we sat down here just moments ago with Republican Senator Bill Hagerty of Tennessee, who joined us in studio, and we started by asking him about the impact of the selection of J.D. Vance as the vice presidential nominee on the race.
I think the business community needs to look at the overall ticket and look at the potential of what's going to happen in November. the momentum and the groundswell, and I think JD brings a tremendous amount to this. He's going to help President Trump win in November. And the policies that President Trump will implement, if the business community just looks back to President Trump's prior administration, you think about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the impact on this sclerotic regulatory framework that's in place, this will give us a chance to go back in and make the United States a far more friendly business environment in general. With respect to Senator Vance's particular points of view and perspectives, I'm not going to comment on his behalf on those, and he'll consolidate all of that, I'm certain, with the president's platform going forward. But I do think that, broadly speaking, JD is going to help the president in terms of cementing support here in America. He's going to bring people together that I think it's just an incredibly brilliant pick. You think about President Trump, who has actually been such a great defender of the forgotten men and women here in America. And JD's lived the life that they've experienced. And together, I think they're going to cut across demographic groups. I think it's going to be a massively impactful pick that will help see a change in November that the business community should welcome.
To Kayleigh's point, though, JD Vance's economic priorities include tariffs, a higher minimum wage, and antitrust, which doesn't sound like the economic policies of the grand old party. Is this the new Republican economic platform?
Well, the Republican Party certainly is moving in a way that is embracing the challenges that Americans feel today. If you
is it embracing economic populism?
Well, I think that's one way to phrase it. Yeah. But if you think about what Americans are experiencing, we've seen inflation that's really been through the roof. Gasoline prices, food prices up 40%, over 20%, real wages down 4%. When President Trump was in office before, every demographic sector was moving up. They were improving, blue collar better than white collar. So there's a real appetite and hunger to see that sort of success again. And I think that's exactly what you're going to see in terms of the policies that will emerge from the eventual Trump administration.
Do you think that that policy, especially when it comes to things like trade and tariffs that J.D. Vance also has advocated for in addition to Donald Trump, essentially cements that if they were to win in November, tariffs will be higher?
I think tariffs are certainly going to be on the agenda because what we have is a situation right now on a global basis where we do not have reciprocal trade. The term free trade has been misused so many times. And what we have here in America is one of the most open markets in the world. If you look at our tariff rates, certainly compared to other nations that are our trading partners. We have countries like China that don't play by the rules at all. And one of the most potent tools to deal with this is tariffs. And I fully expect that I saw it in the previous Trump administration. I worked very closely with Bob Lighthizer and his team because the same team that put the phase 1 tariffs in place on China worked closely with me on the free trade agreement that we negotiated and got executed with Japan. There are real issues there that need to be addressed. So I look forward to seeing it addressed myself.
I have to note that the national debt is not mentioned in the new party platform. When we talk about tariffs, the potential inflationary impact, making the 2017 Trump tax cuts permanent, you've seen all the economic reports, and we've even talked about them right here on Bloomberg with you, Senator, that this would add an enormous amount to the federal debt. How do you square this as someone we consider to be a traditional Republican?
Yeah, I have a very optimistic view about this, and I think that a lot of the CBO scoring doesn't take into account the fact that the policies, whether they be tax policies or regulatory policies that encourage capital investment, actually have the effect of growing the economy, and in a dynamic way have the effect of increasing the tax base. We saw this happen after the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was put in place. So I see real potential to grow the economy, and I also say this, and President Trump and I have talked about this on numerous occasions, there are great opportunities to cut spending. What we have in Washington is a huge spending problem. And coming in and taking a very focused and deliberate view toward some of the waste and mismanagement that I see across the board. It's going to be a combination of factors that will be required to begin to get our debt moving in the right direction. But as that begins to happen, I think that we'll see even further economic growth as confidence comes into the system.
I understand the argument that you and many of your colleagues make when it comes to the fact that you could see greater return from the growth that is spurred by tax cuts. Does that mean, though, that no pay-fors are necessary? If we could just get specific about what it is that you would cut in order to offset or where this will be paid for, other than just this general idea of growth.
Oh, there are plenty of places I think we could cut. Look at some of the programs that were put in place with these multi-trillion-dollar, totally partisan bills that were passed back in 2021 by the Democrats. You think about $80 billion going to the IRS to come and snoop on Americans. There are places we've already started to cut back on that. There are places like that that we can cut immediately, and I think we'll continue to dig in and find opportunities. President Trump will challenge each of his cabinet secretaries and agency heads to find those opportunities. I've lived this at a state level. I was Commerce Secretary of my home state. We cut a tremendous amount of funding out, saved money, found waste and sclerosis, and took it out.
The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget had a palpitation when they saw this plan and ran the numbers themselves. And the message from Maya McGinnis, who I know you know there, was you can't get to this with $1 billion here, $1 billion there. This will require entitlement reform. You have to get to Medicare and Social Security. J.D. Vance doesn't want to touch Social Security, and Donald Trump has said that he will not either. Do you?
Well, here's what I think people miss. We're talking about mandatory versus discretionary spending. And most of my colleagues and I spend all of our time on discretionary spending. But there's a huge chunk of mandatory spending that has nothing to do with Medicare, Medicaid, or Social Security. And even more was added to it through the 2021 partisan reconciliation bills. We need to go and take an extremely hard look at these mandatory spending obligations that we have that have nothing to do with people's retirement, their Social Security, their Medicare or Medicaid, and begin to address that. We can make significant headway, again, on both the mandatory side as well as the discretionary side, and still abide by the pledge not to touch Medicare, Medicaid, or Social Security.
I'd also like to ask you about cryptocurrencies, given your role on the banking committee, but also knowing that Senator J.D. Vance is from Ohio, a state in which the chairman of the banking committee, Sherrod Brown, is in a tough re-election fight against a pro-crypto candidate, Bernie Moreno. And I wonder if J.D. Vance entering the race puts crypto more into the actual fore of this election cycle. How do you expect it to play in, not just in the race that could define the next chair or ranking member of the banking committee, but more broadly?
Well, I certainly hope it puts it into play. I think crypto technology is a defining point in this election. If you like centralized control over your financial transactions, that's exactly where Sherrod Brown and the Democrats and this White House administration have been. They have been incredibly hostile toward crypto technology. If you like a decentralized option that allows for more freedom and liberty and also supports some of the greatest technology innovations that I've seen since the development of the internet, I think you're going to be supporting President Trump and J.D. Vance. J.D. has a great deal of experience in Silicon Valley. I think he possesses the great capacity to see this potential here. President Trump and I have spent a significant amount of time talking about the crypto technology industry and the potential that it holds for America. I can tell you, both gentlemen want to see this industry here in America as it evolves. We want to see this innovation happening here because I think it has great potential, great potential. We don't want to see it go offshore. And what we need is a regulatory construct that will allow that, not push it away. And right now, what you have is a choice that would, crush the industry. That's what comes from the SEC right now. That's what comes from, frankly, Democrat members of my own Senate Banking Committee and this administration. We need to move toward the policies that I'm certain we're going to adopt in the Republican administration that will be very favorable toward this industry.
Senator, we have to ask you, of course, about Donald Trump's well-being after what happened last weekend. We were reporting that he was making a lot of phone calls the day after on Sunday. Yeah. And you indicated earlier that you were on the other end of the line on one of those calls. What did you talk about?
I talked with him Sunday evening for, 20, 25 minutes, and he was immediately talked about how divine intervention played a role in this. And if you think about how close he came to being assassinated, it's just, I fully appreciate the hand of God that watched for him. But he immediately talked about the father of two, the firefighter that lost his life, leaving a family without a dad, those that were injured on stage there that day. He has very real concern for that. I was with Kid Rock that night, and we got on stage together and really fired up the crowd to go to the GoFundMe site to support those people, their families, and in a terrible time for them. President Trump was not surprising to me at all. He's always been that way in terms of his care and concern for others. That was the top of the conversation. Mm-hmm. And then we talked about how things are going to move forward. And I really think that the public is shocked by what happened. I think it shocked us all to our core. And we need resilience, we need strength. And when he came up with his fist raised in the air, mm-hmm. I think that's a picture that's going to be one of the most iconic in the world. America needs a strong leader right now. The world needs a strong leader right now. I speak with world leaders very often, given my role in the Foreign Relations Committee and the fact that I served in the previous administration as a diplomat. there is a great need for a strong America right now, and I think President Trump is moving right into that lane.
That was Senator Bill Hagerty of Tennessee, the Republican, with us here in Milwaukee on what is day 2 of the Republican National Convention. Really interesting conversation that we typically have in Washington about economic policy. He's gearing up for the next day here. Looking forward to a conversation about crypto that might be a little different than the one happening now. Absolutely.
Donald Trump has really tried to position himself to be a pro-crypto candidate to a large extent. We thought that may have begun with Vivek Ramaswamy, actually, when he dropped out of the primary process and got Donald Trump's ear, but potentially that's something that grows with the addition of J.D. Vance to the ticket. That's for sure. Let's reassemble our panel. Rick Davis at Stonecourt Capital is with us alongside Jeanne Zaino at Iona University, Bloomberg Politics contributors. What do you make of all this talk about divine intervention? It seems to have gripped this convention.
Yeah, I thought that was such a fascinating part of your discussion, because this is something we are hearing from not just Republicans. I mean, if you guys have watched these rallies, and Donald Trump himself said the other day, he seldom turns his head. They seldom put up graphics like they did just a moments before he was shot at. And he believes, and so do many Republicans and Americans, that it was some kind of divine intervention. And he has talked about that openly. And I suspect that's a theme we're going to hear, just like you heard from Senator Hagerty going forward in his talk and in his speech on Thursday night about what he is going to do with the fact that he feels like he had a divine intervention that saved him and what he hopes to take from that. So I thought that part of the discussion was just fascinating. And then, of course, the economic aspects as well.
Yeah, well, just on the divine intervention idea, you heard that from the speakers last night. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene talking about the hand of God being on Donald Trump. Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina said similar things as well. But on the economic policy, to Jeanne's point, as we had the conversation with the senator, something we've continually asked is we talk about things like tariffs, which were talked about quite extensively last night, which of course was day one focused on the economy. We know that there is a repercussion of higher tariffs, which is higher costs, which is something that Republicans have also been talking about, higher costs under the Biden administration. How do we think about the way that these things kind of run in a circle? And for a voter, do higher tariffs sound as good as or the idea of them sound as good as they actually will be in practice and in the reality? Is this a good message for Republicans to be running with?
Yeah, I think one of the things that Senator Hagerty pointed out is this sort of economic populism. I kind of call it economic realism, because the Republican Party is now the party of working class multicultural voters, right? And so when you think about what a tariff means to them, we're not the party of the country club corporate executives anymore. So tariffs to corporations has a different impact than tariffs to individuals. And sure, it is a tax on individuals, but when you look at the people supporting Donald Trump, they haven't had the run-up in finances that a lot of people have had over the course of the various corrections that we've had. And so they're not so much worried about what the future holds. They're worried about today. And you hear all the time in the focus groups about, I had more money in my pocket under Donald Trump than I do under Joe Biden. And so when you say tariffs, they read that as protecting my economics, not squandering them. And so I think—
Is that being honest with them?
I think they've already made this case, right? I mean, I don't think anybody's actually selling to them that tariffs are somehow going to increase their pay. Right. But they're not paying those taxes. I mean, the reality is they pay them in a really regressive way, cost of goods. And the fact that that's run up so much without a strong tariff regime under the Biden administration, you know, it causes voters to question whether or not all this talk about tariffs is going to make a difference to them.
It's amazing what you just said. Republican Party is the party of working class, multicultural Americans. I thought you were the Democrat here.
No, that's right. And that's why I think, to get back to the conversation about somebody like Nikki Haley and the establishment part of the party, that's not who they are appealing to.
But do you see that as being the case? Because Joe Biden's lost in that world.
You know, I think that's where they are headed. I don't know if they have fully been able to embrace that. But, you know, what I think of is this division between the reality of the numbers and the public opinion polls and how people feel. And you talk to any economist, they will tell you numbers are pretty good. The market's been strong. Unemployment at a 50-year low. Inflation is moving in the right direction. There are all of these very positive macro signs, and it's not felt on Main Street. And that's one of the challenges for Joe Biden and the Democrats. They have not been able to reach people with these positive numbers. People feel like things are bad, and they are embracing that argument. Sure, there's a lot of things to do, but I think, to your question, there is something that is not honest about this populist argument that they are selling, but that many people on Main Street are buying.
It strikes me as you talk about Joe Biden that we are now about an hour into this program from Milwaukee and haven't talked about the sit-down interview he gave with Lester Holt on NBC last night. Does that suggest, Jeanne, and we'll do so more in the next hour, I promise our listeners and viewers, that he didn't accomplish what he intended to with that interview? He didn't steal back the narrative from Donald Trump?
It not only suggests that he did not steal back the narrative from Donald Trump. I think the problem for Joe Biden now is we sort of can only hope that he does no harm when he goes out to these interviews. He didn't do much harm last night. He was very defensive, I thought, with Lester Holt. And so, you know, whereas many Democrats are looking for a moment where he can embrace a huge tragedy in American politics with soaring rhetoric, that's not what we can expect at this point. So to your question, he didn't steal the narrative, far from it. He sort of just, I guess, tread water is the best way to say it.
Well, we'll have more analysis of that interview with Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis, our political panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors, in the next hour of Balance of Power. We're also on watch for a verdict in Senator Bob Menendez, the Democrat from New Jersey, trial, where, of course, he actually, in the red headline just crossing the Bloomberg terminal, he has been convicted by that jury at his corruption trial. He, of course, was accused of accepting cash, gold, Mercedes-Benz as bribes. Again, the Democratic senator from New Jersey, Bob Menendez, Joe, guilty in that trial. We'll have more details coming up.
That's right. He pleaded not guilty to 16 federal charges, including bribery, fraud, acting as a foreign agent, and obstruction. Declined to testify in his own defense, and as we learn now, found guilty, convicted here, the senator from New Jersey. We'll have much more on this coming up, Kaylee, in our next hour.
Indeed. So stick with us here in Milwaukee, live from the Republican National Convention on Bloomberg TV and radio. Live from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to our TV and radio audiences worldwide. Welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lines. Of course, here in Milwaukee, we're spending a lot of time talking about the Republican Party this week after the selection of J.D. Vance as Donald Trump's vice presidential nominee. But it is a Democrat who has just made the news, breaking just moments ago. The Democratic senator from New Jersey, Bob Menendez, has been convicted by a jury in his corruption trial in which he was facing charges related to the FBI seizing 13 gold bars, nearly $500,000 in cash, and a Mercedes-Benz at his home. He has been found guilty, as have two New Jersey businessmen who were accused of bribing him. They have also been convicted. So far, all defendants, Joe, have been convicted on all counts.
A 9-week trial that many people associate with the image of gold bars, Kaylee, and of course the Mercedes-Benz that made so much news during the course of this story. Only 3 days of deliberations. I say only. It took the jury 3 days to get to this point. Recalling the tapes that we heard, Kaylee, the video from Morton's Steakhouse in downtown Washington, D.C., in which they spoke openly about this interference that he has now been found guilty of. The conviction coming 4 months, of course, before Election Day, and likely ending any hope that he had to keep his job.
Yeah, of course, he was no longer going to even try to maintain his seat as a Democrat, instead as an independent. But yes, this guilty verdict probably changes very much politically for Bob Menendez's political future. And that goes before November. It'll be very interesting to hear the response we get from Senate Democrats, who were basically calling for the legal process to play out, not necessarily calling for him to resign as a sitting senator.
That's right.
And so that is one of the questions we will have in the most immediate term. We'll have much more on this later on this hour with our political panel, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, who are here with us in Milwaukee. But of course, there is a reason why we're here, and it's because of the Republican National Convention, where the big news yesterday was the selection of Senator J.D. Vance from Ohio as Donald Trump's running mate. We want to get more on that now and head over to Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who has more details on the junior senator. Hey, Tyler.
Yeah, hey, Kelly. Our Bloomberg audience might first know J.D. Vance is a venture capitalist and a member of the Senate Banking Committee, where he's largely taken a more populist view when it comes to the economy and business. And when we analyze the type of legislation that he has shepherded through that committee, it includes bills that would make it more difficult for big lenders to get bigger. He's also been keen to cut down on credit card fees, and in one move partnered with Senator Elizabeth Warren, a Democrat from Massachusetts, on a bill to claw back executive compensation in the event of a bank failure. Now, he is a staunch defender of big oil and has pushed big banks against ESG policy commitments. For a sense, here was Senator Vance when the nation's largest Wall Street CEOs last testified on Capitol Hill.
If you guys are going to use the financial power that you've accumulated to go to war against the values of our voters, impoverish our constituents who rely on cheap energy, and destroy the jobs of people who work in the energy sector, why should we listen to you when you come and ask us for a tax break or for reasonable regulations?
Vance has, though, largely been opposed to more financial regulation. For example, he's against the new proposed rule for higher capital rule requirements for big banks. But Joe and Kaylee, interesting to point out that he has actually applauded the FTC's Lina Khan and the Biden administration's push for more regulation and cracking down when it comes to big tech.
Tyler, thank you so much. With us live in Milwaukee, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall on day 2 here at the RNC. And we're joined now by Governor Mike Dunleavy of Alaska. Governor, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining us here in Milwaukee. We're all sweating a little bit here. It's not quite Alaska weather. I hope you're enjoying it so far. What do you make of this pick, J.D. Vance? So many of us were surprised by it not being a surprise name yesterday. This has been something long in the works.
Oh, well, I think the president is picking somebody that will carry forth his agenda after he leaves office. And while President Trump is in office, obviously J.D. Vance will be a close confidant to the president. Mm-hmm. He's younger. That'll probably appeal to younger Americans. But I think, I have confidence in the president that he knows what he's doing. I don't know J.D. that well. I know he's a senator from Ohio, but hope to get to know him here in the future after November 5th. Mm-hmm.
Well, he's only been a senator from Ohio for about a year and a half. Yeah. He is a political newbie. Yeah. And I wonder, as a sitting Republican governor, what you think about the idea of a governor who has executive leadership running one of the states in the United States of America, why that selection may not have been made.
Well, keep in mind, President Trump was not elected to any office before he was elected president.
Sure.
And sometimes when you get a perspective outside of government, and I've been outside of government, I've been inside of government, sometimes when you get a perspective outside of government, you carry a perspective of the people into government, as opposed to being a career government official and looking at the world from that perspective. So I think that's what probably factored, at least partly into the decision by the president.
Bring us your unique perspective on energy coming from Alaska and what a Trump 2.0 would mean, because the Biden administration is reminding us on the daily that our output right now, we're pumping more oil and gas than ever in the history of the United States. Yet there seems to be this idea that Trump would be friendlier to the energy sector than Joe Biden. What would in fact change?
I think he will. I think he'll be a lot friendlier.
Tell us specifically.
Well, I mean, President Biden has called for a moratorium on shipping gas overseas. Mm-hmm. That's not going to happen under President Trump.
So that's lifted immediately.
Yeah.
Okay.
In terms of ANWR, which was the National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska on the North Slope, where there is oil and is gas, under the 2017 law that was passed, those leases went up for sale. The Biden administration illegally, and it is true, it's illegally, shut those leases down. Mm-hmm. That'd be lifted, I believe, under President Trump. Mm-hmm. And then taking up upwards of 13 million acres of NPRA, National Petroleum Reserve, off the table for oil and gas, I think that'll go back on the table. President Trump was the best president in the history of Alaska, from my perspective. When I came into office and I had my first meeting with President Trump, he said to me, "What can I do to help Alaska?" And that was every single meeting. And he probably did more than any other president in the history of the state. President Biden, under his administration, there are approximately 65 actions by the federal government against Alaska, taking land off the table for oil and gas exploration, closing down the Tongass National Forest, not going through with a land exchange to help some of our indigenous people in King Cove be able to get a road out so their people don't have to fight weather with airplanes. The list goes on and on and on. But under our president that we have right now, President Biden, 65 actions. That's more actions against a state than the federal government has against places like Iran. It's incredible.
If we could just continue the energy conversation for a moment longer, what we have heard a lot from Donald Trump and those close to him is this idea that it's just deregulation, unleash American energy, if you will. And you spoke a bit to that idea. But when we think about these oil and gas companies, which we're very familiar with here at Bloomberg, they have to be incentivized to actually spend their capital. Capital discipline has been the name of the game for years. It's about returning it to shareholders, not necessarily investing in new production in a world that is trying to transition to green energy. So beyond just deregulating, does more need to be done to incentivize these businesses to actually drill more in places like Alaska?
If we truly deregulate, that is going to save money. You won't have to spend as much money potentially on permitting and litigation. And to the concept of transition, I really believe that that concept disappeared several months ago. With the advent of new chips from NVIDIA, the Blackwell chip, the whole AI movement, you're going to need 3 to 6 times as much energy as you have now to power those server factories. So I think it's going to be additionality, not transition. You're going to see more discussion about additionality. More wind and solar, more oil and gas, more nuclear, more any type of energy possible. And I think the locales and the countries that win the energy war in that respect are going to win the supercomputing and the AI war too.
If you were the energy secretary, and you can respond to that as you want, how would you approach nuclear? This is something actually we talk about a lot on Bloomberg because of the incredible boom in data centers and AI and the massive amounts of power required. We're talking about now potentially opening data centers on the sites of nuclear power plants. Yes. What does the future hold for America and nuclear? You know, nuclear has had a troubled past, and unfortunately, some of the press it's got, I think, is unwarranted. There's probably been fewer individuals killed or died as a result of nuclear accidents than almost any other type of energy put forward in terms of accidents. But if I were the energy secretary, and we're dreaming here for a moment, I would facilitate a consortium among states, among private industry, provinces in Canada, and maybe other countries to come up with a calendar, for example, on small nukes to say, how many small nukes can we get in the hopper to permit, to design, and to get a whole industry set up behind creating new nuclear facilities across the country. I think that's one of the things that the nuclear industry wants, is they want to know if we're going to begin a process of creating a whole new industry on small nukes, do we have the commitment to actually fund those nukes, pay for those nukes, and site those nukes in various places? So I think that would be a big step.
Governor, I just picked up on the words you used there. We're dreaming here. Are you saying that as another way to say we're speaking hypothetically, or because you actually do dream of being energy secretary?
No. That was hypothetical. I'm just saying for the moment here.
So if Donald Trump offered you that job?
Well, I'd have to have discussions with the president, but I'm looking forward to working with the president, helping the president, and moving this great country forward and Alaska forward.
Have you spoken with him since Saturday?
I spoke with his campaign folks, and I sent him a text. But I also understand that after such a traumatic moment, the president's going to need to talk with his inner circle and his family more so than folks outside.
Did he respond? Was he texting over the weekend?
He was texting with some. Yeah. I got a text back immediately from the campaign chair, so we're in contact.
Yeah.
Well, as we continue to grapple with the aftermath of this weekend, pretty much every person we have talked to, elected official or otherwise, has talked about how the tone of this convention needs to be different as a result. Much more toned down rhetoric, a lowering of the temperature across the board, more of a message of unity. And I just wonder, given what you see in your state or just in your position as a governor, if you see an America that is truly capable of that right now, given how deeply rooted our divisions seem to be.
I do. I think what happened yesterday shook everyone to the core. I really do believe that. I was on the floor yesterday on the convention, and I did not pick up from anyone that there was a attitude or an atmosphere of vindictiveness or quote, going after folks. Quite the opposite. I think people were excited about the possibilities of another Trump administration coming in here November 5th. The discussions were very, I think, positive. And I'm an individual that doesn't really tolerate that type of talk, to be honest with you. I'm not part of that. Don't want to be part of that. And I think the country. I hope the country is at a point now where we start to focus more on policies as opposed to personalities.
Well, today's theme, crime and immigration. If there's any one of these 4 days where the rhetoric could get hot, where the red meat's going out the crowd, I presume it will be today. Do you agree?
Possibly. But I mean, those two topics, crime and immigration, I think are topics that are near and dear to most Americans' hearts. And we are a country of immigrants. But, I believe in a strong wall with many doors. I believe that we should have a strong wall in which we have immigration, in which we're bringing people into this country that want to be Americans, they're going to contribute to America. Unfettered, wide open borders, I think, is a catastrophe for any sovereign in the world, especially this country. And in terms of crime, I think over the last couple of years, we've seen our cities burn. We've seen the homeless issue escalate. I think it's problematic, and I do think a change in administration will bring changes on the ground.
Well, it's interesting to hear you say this as the governor of Alaska, which is perhaps furthest removed from the southern border, at least in a physical sense, as any state can be. To what extent would you say this is the dominant thought of the people that you govern, or is it a different issue?
We are far away, but unfortunately for Alaska, we've had more deaths per capita through fentanyl than any other state in the country. And that fentanyl is coming through the southern border. So just that alone, if we can somehow impact that, affect that in a positive way to reduce that flow, is going to help Alaska. It's going to help every country in the United States, probably Hawaii as well, even though Hawaii is in the middle of the Pacific. But unfettered borders doesn't help anyone. And as I mentioned, in Alaska's case, the fentanyl coming over the border hurts us as well.
Is that so much a border issue, if I could ask you quickly, or is that actually a China issue at the root?
Probably a combination of both. But if you have a southern border in which there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people coming over, not checked, unfettered, getting into the country, and you have cartels in Mexico, it doesn't take a genius to put two and two together that you're going to have some drug problems.
It's really interesting to hear that that's a long journey from the southern border to Alaska. Talk to us about the path that it takes and the policy needed to stop this.
Just it's the same way it gets to Minnesota or Maine. You can drive to Alaska. You have to go through Canada. You can fly. You can mail it. You can take it on ships. These people are very creative. As a response to this, we just passed the bill that I signed a week before I came to the convention that increased the penalties for dealing drugs that result in a death to a second-degree murder charge. Because we have to get serious about this. Everybody knows somebody that has been impacted by drugs. Everybody knows somebody that knows somebody in which they may have had a loved one that overdosed on some of these drugs and cut short of very promising lives for these people. We've got to do something about it. The border is part of that solution. Discussions with China is part of that solution as well.
Of course, Senator J.D. Vance has a very personal history with drug abuse in his own family as well. He has talked about that openly. He did so again when discussing fentanyl in his first interview after being named the vice presidential nominee yesterday. As we consider policy that J.D. Vance is likely to adopt, we've been describing him as a populist, an isolationist, potentially just a newer, younger version of Donald Trump. How do you see your party changing as a Republican governor, as we are not just considering President Donald Trump, but potentially a Vice President J.D. Vance, who is very, very similar?
I think, again, time will tell exactly what the new Vice President nominee is really thinking on some of these issues. I tend to know what President Trump is thinking on these issues. The changes that you're referring to the party, I don't know how large or big those changes are really going to be. I think there's going to be some nuances in implementation. I think there's going to be some emphasis on certain policy decisions. But I don't know how great a change. I mean, I think the Republican Party.
But this isn't Mitch McConnell's Republican Party anymore, really?
I think it's America's Republican Party. I think when Donald Trump came in, it became a party of the people as opposed to elected officials, politicos, oligarchs, et cetera.
There are 50,000 people here for this Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. Most of them have never been to Alaska, and I'm guessing will never go. What do you want them to know? What do you want them to know about your state?
Well, from an economic standpoint, Alaska is part of the solution for America. We have the largest oil field in North America, conventional oil field in North America. We have over 100 trillion cubic feet of gas that can help America and our Asian allies. We have 49 of the 50 rare earths that could help the United States be strategically independent of China. We have 1/7 of the country's timber. We have some of the largest fishing ports in North America. No, we're a bastion of freedom. We're the only Republican state left on the West Coast. And we take our freedoms seriously. We're a Second Amendment state unlike any other. We have the highest per capita of retired veterans in the state of Alaska. We have admirals and generals that retire to the state of Alaska. And that we are the fort for Alaska. We're only 2.5 miles from Russia, 50 water miles from Russia. We have the Russians in our airspace that we chase out on a continual basis. We have the Chinese working their ships up through the Bering Strait. So we are a strategic part of this country.
All right, Governor. Well, thank you for spending some of your time here in Wisconsin with us. Maybe one day we will see you in Alaska. That's Governor Mike Dunleavy of Alaska. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, we also want to talk about another state, and that's what just happened in New Jersey. As the news broke within the last 20 minutes that New Jersey Senator, a Democrat, Bob Menendez, has been found guilty on all counts in his corruption trial. The judge in that case has set the sentencing for October 29th, Joe. That's for all 3 defendants, as 2 others were charged with Senator Menendez. He faces as much as 20 years on the most serious charges.
This is really something. This broke a short time ago. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, you see a view of the courthouse, a stakeout set up outside as reporters wait for the next leg in this story. Menendez pleaded not guilty. 16 federal charges, Kaylee: bribery, fraud, acting as a foreign agent, and obstruction. Now we have a guilty verdict.
Yeah, we'll get more reaction on that from our political panel, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, who are here with us live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, for our coverage of the Republican National Convention. So stick with us straight ahead, right here on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lines alongside Joe Matthew, live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where we're following breaking news in New Jersey, the conviction on all counts of Democratic Senator Bob Menendez. And now we have heard, Joe, from the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, who has posted on Twitter, in light of this guilty verdict, Senator Menendez must now do what is right for his constituents, the Senate, and our country, and resign.
There you have it from the Majority Leader. A lot of folks, Kaylee, in Washington, a lot of Democrats thought that statement should have come earlier. Let's assemble our political panel now for their take on all of this. Rick Davis at Stonecourt Capitol, Jeanne Zaino at Iona University. Does Jeanne need to step down for the good of the Democratic Party?
He absolutely does. And to your point, many Democrats felt this should have come a long time ago. You know, I live in the tri-state area. Bob Menendez had complaints filed against him in 2006, the year he was elected. He was indicted again in 2015. Those charges dropped, but he was severely admonished by the Senate's Ethics Committee for that. And now, once again, 2023, he is finally convicted. And for the good of the people of New Jersey and for the Democrats, he needs to step down. They've already nominated Andy Kim to run, but Bob Menendez is still running as an independent.
Yeah, and we are seeing, I believe these are live images outside the courthouse in the aftermath of this. If you're watching Bloomberg TV and radio, apparently those aren't live images, but we are seeing pictures of Senator Bob Menendez. Of course, if we do indeed see him and get a reaction to him from this verdict, we'll bring that to all of you. But as we also consider his fate in the Senate, the idea that Democrats are now calling for his resignation after, I believe, all but John Fetterman were reluctant to do so in the last several months, Rick. How hard is it for a Democrat to make the case that Donald Trump is unqualified to serve if he's a convicted felon? If you now have a convicted felon that still could, if he decides not to resign, continue to walk the halls of the U.S. Senate?
Yeah, this is kind of an eyesore for Democrats. It's an unfortunate thing that a United States senator would be convicted of a federal crime. It's only happened 7 times in history. I know it seems like more, but this has been a recurring occasion for Governor Menendez, as Jeanne said. And so, yeah, I think that it's really going to take the leadership of the Senate to insist that he vacate the seat and give them the best chance they can to win. Look, I mean, New Jersey could be an interesting state if Donald Trump continues to make progress in this race. He can put states like New Jersey in play. It was very close in 2020. And so I think that Chuck Schumer and the other leaders in the Democratic Party and the Senate really have to press hard. Menendez has nothing to lose. He's convicted. Will be going to prison. And so the question is whether or not he even cares. But Governor Murphy has the ability then to replace. Maybe he puts Andy Kim in as the nominee, can basically serve in the election as an incumbent. Yeah. And remember, Governor Murphy's wife ran against Andy Kim. Maybe she'd like a short stint in the Senate before she retires from politics.
About that. If you're just joining us, Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey found guilty. This is, of course, the corruption trial that included the gold bars, the Mercedes-Benz, sensational storytelling that made this a front pager here, Jeanne. He's certain to appeal. Should he speak to reporters today to make his case when he comes out?
If I was his lawyer, I would say absolutely not. He needs to defend himself or continue to defend himself. He needs to step aside for the good of the people of New Jersey and deal with his own legal challenge, which are formidable. He's facing 20 years in prison, although to your point, he'll appeal and doubt he would get that much. But let's not forget, chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee before he stepped down from that. Yeah. He is charged with taking bribes, Qatar, doing business on behalf of the Egyptian military. This is ugly. To your point, it's also a story that resonates because he's talking about gold bars, convertible Mercedes-Benzes, and blaming his wife, who's also wrapped up in this. It is an ugly story, and it is more than time for the people of New Jersey to get free of this. And to Kayleigh, your point, Senator Fetterman, his neighboring, if you will, senator, Democrat, was one of the first to call vocally for him to step aside. Many Democrats didn't join, and now that Chuck Schumer has sort of opened those floodgates just a minute ago, I think we're going to see the calls, and they should be made. He needs to go now. And whether it's Andy Kim or Murphy's wife, I don't think it should be. They need to fill that seat.
Well, as we consider the responses of Democrats here, obviously the senators are most notable, given that it is the body in which Senator Menendez is a member. But what about Joe Biden? How does he handle this? How does he need to handle this? How could it reflect back on him as a potential attack Republicans can use in this cycle?
So for all the reasons you mentioned about he's running against somebody who has been convicted of a felony, he should immediately call for the senator to step aside. There is no place in politics for this. These are ugly charges of which he has now been convicted. He should fight those, and he should not continue to stay. And I think that's what Joe Biden should come out and forcefully say, agreeing with the leader of the Democrats in the Senate. It is time to go. This is not, if you're Joe Biden, he should say who we are as Democrats, and we should not countenance his continuation in the Senate while he tries to defend himself.
Well, the politics are awfully important here. You're not legal analysts. And I wonder, Rick, how you would use this. If you were digging into Oppo and Bob Menendez, how would you leverage this story against Democrats?
Well, I think that you have to be a little careful because every time you bring up, here's a politician who's just been convicted of a federal charge, you're actually reminding everybody that Donald Trump has just been convicted of federal charges. And I think you really don't get much out of it, right? I mean, he's already been convicted in court, but he's also been convicted in the court of public opinion. And so I don't think it really gets you much. I think it's a good thing to play in Washington, D.C. to make Democrats in the Senate look disorganized. Sure. The Democratic Party is in a critical state right now because of the disastrous state of the Joe Biden campaign. So this is just piling on at this stage. And the reality is it's a bad news day for them, but it will go away, and they will focus on the contest in New Jersey in November for the Senate. They desperately need to hold on to that seat in order to retain control. And if I were digging up my oppo on Menendez, it would be so easy because I only had to sit in a court to get everything I needed.
That's right.
You mentioned the state of the Biden campaign, Rick. It's worth pointing out that Joe Biden is in Las Vegas today. He was sitting for an interview with BET after sitting for an interview with NBC's Lester Holt yesterday, which aired in prime time, 9 p.m. Eastern, when a lot of people were probably also tuned in to speeches at the Republican convention. He wanted the interview to be about policy, and he made that very clear to Mr. Holt at the very end of the interview. What was your read on his performance? Did he do what he needed to do in terms of damage control, knowing that prior to the assassination attempt this past weekend, all we were talking about is whether or not he was going to drop out?
Yeah, it was a pretty chippy interview on the president's behalf, and I agree with your assessment of that. I think that he needs to understand that when you do interviews, it's not up to you to decide what kind of questions you get. It's up to the interviewer, and he's done so few, maybe he's just out of practice. So I think that it didn't go well for him last night. I mean, it's funny, you wake up this morning, and Joe Biden spent all his time attacking Donald Trump in that interview, and Donald Trump is in Milwaukee asking for unity. I mean, did you ever think that you would face a day like this? So I think that this is more troubling for the campaign, for the Biden campaign. I think after that interview, frankly, you will hear more calls for Biden to step down because the Democratic Party can't succeed at the top of the ticket with that kind of performance.
Well, it's kind of a Trump mechanism, isn't it, to criticize the journalist for the questions they're asking? Here's what you should be covering. It doesn't play the same way, apparently, when Joe Biden does it.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think that defensive nature of Lester, why are you asking me this? Ask that. It just doesn't land right. And, the president had a, pretty good period, a couple days in which he was talking about unity and those things. And I thought that the interview last night, he seemed so defensive, so stunned that he was being asked those questions. And so I think at this point for Democrats, it just reinforces a problem that they've had, which is that they can't expect much out of Joe Biden with these appearances. If he can, again, just tread water, that's almost the best they can hope. And what they want is somebody to embrace the moment, a Bill Clinton sort of rhetorical moment. Joe Biden has had those around January 6th. We've seen those Ronald Reagan. They want that after the attempted assassination of a presidential candidate, and they haven't gotten it out of Joe Biden, nor can they expect to at this point.
All right, well, we've talked about it at length already, so we should probably give our listeners and viewers a little taste of that interview. Joe Biden sitting down with Lester Holt on NBC last night.
We knew this was going to be a close race from the moment he announced. I think one of the arguments that get made, you have the most successful presidency of any president in modern history, maybe since Franklin Roosevelt. Passed more major legislation no one thought could get done. We're able to put together consensus. We're able to unite NATO. We're able to deal in foreign policy. Why don't you just decide to rest on those laurels? And the answer is because the job's not finished.
He's talking there about his efforts to unite NATO, to add to it under his presidency. Here in Milwaukee, the Republicans are talking about unity as well. But frankly, what we're talking about is a Republican Party that already is very much unified around Donald Trump, by and large. And we saw that on full display on the convention floor. We cannot say the same about the Democratic Party around Joe Biden right now. And for all the conversation, Rick, of the assassination attempt of this past weekend, whether or not that actually may have saved Joe Biden's reelection effort, do you think that conversation is still alive?
Absolutely. As I said, after last night's performance with Lester Holt, there are going to be Democrats scratching their heads saying, how in the world are we going to be able to mount a campaign if this is the product? They spent all day preparing for this. This was his idea, President Biden's idea, and I thought it was a big flop, especially in the contrast with, as you say, what's going on here in Milwaukee with the Republican Party. And there are a lot of down-ticket races, Senate races, House races, that Democrats have already started focusing on, and they realize they're stuck in the mud if they can't fix the top of the ticket.
So you've got another interview today is out in Las Vegas. There's more West Coast travel to try to counter-program the RNC here. What kind of travel is he going to be up to during the course of this campaign? And are down-ballot candidates going to want to share a stage with Joe Biden?
At this point, when you look at the polls, arguably the down ballot candidates will not. I am not a fan of that, by the way. I think that is always a mistake. But I think embrace the incumbent. But it's a tough decision when you look at these polls and they're running ahead of him. In terms of travel, he did not have a very robust travel schedule in 2020 because of COVID, which seemed to help him. Now he doesn't have COVID, and so he's got to be out there. And you listen to that interview, and the best Democrats can hope for at this point, which is Joe Biden doesn't do any harm. And that is a very, very tough position to be in when his poll numbers are what they are. You look at Donald Trump, you look at J.D. Vance, you look at their issues alone. A Democratic candidate who can make this case should be doing much better in these polls. And Joe Biden, unfortunately, who promised to be a transitional candidate or president, is not. And that is why I agree with Rick. The calls for him to step down are still coming.
All right. Great panel and a great conversation, as always. They're with us for the week here in Milwaukee. Rick Davis, Stonecourt Capital, Jeanne Zaino of Iona University, our signature panel here on Balance of Power. As we turn our attention to the financial markets now, we want to see how things are working as we focus on politics here in Milwaukee. We've got a lot more of our coverage coming up. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle joins us now from New York. Abigail, what are you looking at?
Joe, there's a really interesting split that we're seeing right now for markets, and that is specifically that we have the S&P 500 and even more so the Dow Jones Industrial Average trading to the upside. On the other hand, big tech is down. So we've been talking a lot about the Trump trade, or sectors and stocks that would benefit potentially from the former president's economic populism and protectionist policy. But now, as you were talking about last hour, there's also the Vance trade to consider, specifically around big tech. He has signaled that perhaps he will support a crackdown on big tech, openly praising FTC Chair Lina Khan. And so these big tech names, a lot of them, NVIDIA, Meta, Google, they are down sharply, down more than 1%, down for a second day in a row. This, of course, is the real engine of the market from a point standpoint. So if this trend continues, we are going to see this rotation out of big tech and into some more of the value-oriented names that we looked at last hour, such as the stocks behind the Dow transports, insurers, healthcare, banks, and the like. So that would be pretty healthy. As for DJT itself, or of course Trump Media and Entertainment, down about 9% on the day. Since the debate, to smooth out the moves a little bit, because lots of volatility, not surprisingly, volatility associated, of course, with the former president in many ways. We do have it up about 33%, but lots of big moves after yesterday's greater than 30% move. Yesterday, today down almost 10%. So again, volatility there. And then Kaylee, finally, if we are over the last 5 days to go a little bit more macro, Bitcoin, that's higher. And of course, that would be a sign of the Trump trade because the former president is considered to be pro-Bitcoin. On the other hand, it's interesting. I was surprised by this. The dollar relative to the Mexican peso losing some ground. Yesterday, the dollar is losing ground today. Yesterday, gaining ground. Of course, his last term, the former president, not easy on Mexico. And then finally, I threw in Tesla. This isn't entirely fair, but on the day, it is down about 2%, Kaylee. Over the last couple of weeks, it's up about 40%. But Elon Musk, of course, stepping out as one of the former president's most ardent supporters.
All right, Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle in New York. Thank you so much. Now, as she was talking about this idea of Trump trades and Bitcoin being one of them, it's worth pointing out Donald Trump has pledged to promote Bitcoin mining in the U.S., which has made crypto investors eager to learn more about his potential policies. This is also something we discussed earlier today here in Milwaukee with Senator Bill Hagerty, the Republican on the Banking Committee, who talked about his conversations he's had with Donald Trump when it comes to crypto. So what exactly could that look like? Let's get more with Nathan Dean of Bloomberg Intelligence, who looks at U.S. policy for us. He's joining us from Washington. So, Nathan, when we talk about what a crypto-friendly president or administration would look like, are we essentially talking about one in which the SEC just has less power to regulate by enforcement?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think there's two scenarios here. The first scenario is J.D. Vance is one of the first candidates we've seen to have such a substantial amount of crypto holdings. I mean, in his last disclosure, he had at least $100,000 worth of Bitcoin. And there's been talk that Senator Vance is actually pushing legislation right now that is more industry friendly than what House legislation came out earlier this year. The idea here is taking away a little bit more of the focus of crypto from the SEC and potentially giving it to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which is where a lot of the crypto world wants. So I think in terms of like Bitcoin and also just other crypto platforms, like Coinbase in particular, a J.D. Vance presidency, if President Trump decides to delegate additional authorities to the vice president and say, here, go play in the crypto space, it could be good for the sector.
Nathan, your phone's always ringing, which we love asking you about. When your clients call terminal users with questions, with concerns. What were the questions and concerns you heard after this appointment?
So it really comes down to Senator Vance's economic populism aspect, because I think a lot of people just presume Republicans equal this or Republicans equal that. And with Senator Vance, it's a little bit more complicated. For example, Senator Vance has been somewhat tough on banks. He has co-sponsored legislation with Senator Elizabeth Warren to claw back incentive compensation plans from the biggest banks. He's worked with Senator Sherrod Brown on railway safety. He's a co-sponsor of Senator Durbin's Credit Card Competition Act. This is the one that will actually take away a lot of money from the banking sector. So he has a mixed record. But on the same side, he's also very much a populist in terms of calling for the Basel III endgame to be done away with, this idea of higher capital requirements. So I wouldn't say that the vice president is always the most catalyst moving or changing pick in terms of policy. But if we get into a scenario where if President Trump wins in November and he decides that he doesn't want to focus on financial regulation and so forth, Senator Vance could have a very powerful position to play there.
I wonder, Nathan, if the real question for terminal users, market participants, isn't as much about the impact that Senator Vance could have if he becomes Vice President Vance in a second Trump administration in the near to medium term, but more like what the selection of J.D. Vance actually means for the likely trajectory of Republican economic policy for years moving forward, potentially, as we consider he's a 39-year-old. We've been talking today about whether or not this marks the end of the old Republican Party and the official establishment of the new right in which economic populism is a forefront issue. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think there's a short-term and a long-term aspect to this. So the short-term is that Senator Vance, like we've just been talking about, will probably be influencing the president if they are elected on things like trades and tariffs. Senator Vance has said multiple times that China is the #1 issue for the United States. So, because the power of the presidency is a lot more powerful there, I think that there's certainly from a market participant perspective, that trade, that tariff debate and so forth should be at the forefront of any market participant as they're assessing their portfolio. But then longer term, how does this play out with the Republican Party? We saw a gentleman from the Teamsters yesterday speak at the Republican National Convention. That sort of flies in the idea of President Biden being the union candidate. So I think that, we are seeing, the changing of the parties, and it's this idea of corporate America versus, this economic populism movement. And look, it's not going away. It's just something that we're going to have to deal with for many, many years to come.
There's something that we're talking about as the Trump trade, Nathan. It usually involves crypto, DJT, solar stocks, maybe you throw banks in there or something. But is the Trump trade real? And if it is, does it outlast this brief period that we're in now?
So I think the idea of the Trump trade is really depending on your time frame. So obviously we've seen prison stocks, private prison stocks move off of this. But that's such a short-term catalyst because that is just at the high idea or the high-level idea of President Trump equals this policy, and therefore private prison stocks would move up. But I think it's really long-term. How does President Trump, if elected, were to implement his policy? Is it legislation? Well, things aren't really going to get done in Congress no matter what happens in the election next year. Is it tax reform? Well, if the House and the Senate goes Republican and President Trump wins, then there is this opportunity for tax reform in terms of the reconciliation. Is it regulation or is it executive order? So think about how these policies actually work out, and you'll get a better time frame. In terms of things we're looking at, investment banks, that's the regulatory angle. If President Trump wins, the Basel III endgame is mostly gone. If he also wins, electric vehicles like Tesla and Rivian will be exposed. But that's also more likely a headline risk associated with executive orders telling the Treasury Department to alter tax credits there. So it really depends. But we have 5 sectors to watch right now in a Trump presidency. It's investment banks, big tech, electric vehicles, manufacturers, and go from there.
All right, Bloomberg Intelligence's Nathan Dean, thank you so much. We do want to go live to outside the courthouse in New York, where Senator Bob Menendez has just been convicted on all counts with which he is charged. His attorneys are speaking now as the senator stands behind them, as you can see on Bloomberg TV. Let's take a quick listen.
And we're going to pursue all appellate avenues aggressively, and we do expect he will be vindicated. Thank you. Senator, they go to the sign.
And that was very quick. As expected, Joe, they are going to appeal this verdict. But of course, as we await that appeal process to actually play out, he already is facing calls from within his own party to resign the current position that he holds in the U.S. Senate. The Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, has said as much. And actually, a statement that came in from the governor of New Jersey, Phil Murphy, says if he refuses to vacate his office, I call on the U.S. Senate to vote to expel him.
Yeah, there are going to be more where these came from, even as he appeals this verdict, which we should, of course, remind everyone he pleaded not guilty to all 16 counts and is promising an appeal. So this story is not over from a legal standpoint, Kaylee. It kind of feels like politically it is.
Well, we'll see what the senator does in the coming days. But as we've been discussing, and especially as we're having this discussion from here in Milwaukee, where Donald Trump has been formally nominated to be the Republican nominee, something he will accept later on this week, when the Democratic Party is positioning a lot of their argument against why he should be not elected in November is because he is in part a convicted felon. So now when you have one of your own who, too, is now a convicted felon, that messaging gets incredibly complicated.
Yeah, that's for sure. This is just a story that emerged a short time ago since we came to air, as a matter of fact. At noontime Eastern, Senator Bob Menendez found guilty of corruption charges. This brings us back to the seizure of gold bars that so many people were talking about, and nearly $500,000 in cash, of course, the Mercedes-Benz. He just said, Kaylee, he has never been a foreign agent, remembering that he was accused of and now found guilty of working on behalf of the Egyptian government. His interactions with Qatar for a former chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is quite remarkable to consider. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, images of that FBI seizure, the cash, the gold bars that were found in his home, will be the enduring images and memories that a lot of people have of this trial.
Absolutely. It really is just so remarkable. And of course, during the course of this trial, the senator did blame a lot of that activity on his wife, Nadine, who also has been charged. Her trial has been delayed as she grapples with breast cancer treatments. But that is another way in which this will continue to be in the spotlight as her own trial plays out. So it's hard to see how this issue goes away for the senator in the immediate term as he goes through this appeal process.
October 29 is the sentencing date the judge announced today for Menendez and his two co-defendants, also found guilty. The question, of course, will be the political ramifications here, Kaylee, with now Chuck Schumer calling on Bob Menendez to step down, to leave the Senate, and, of course, the implications that would follow. I want to add a voice, no stranger to New Jersey politics or Washington, and that's Lisa Camooso Miller, former RNC communications director and host of the Friday Reporter podcast. Lisa, thanks for jumping on with us here on this breaker. Does Bob Menendez need to step down and leave Washington now?
Yeah, there's no doubt about it, Joe. I mean, this is something that is going to be distracting to the district. It's going to be distracting to the state. And it's the kind of thing that if Senator Menendez really values the voice of the voters in the state, he should step aside and he should deal with this issue himself outside of the Senate. Also, too, there's a question of integrity. I mean, really, the integrity of the office and the importance of having a voice of good reason there is very critical.
Mm-hmm.
Well, certainly, especially as we consider, which Joe was just pointing out, the role that he had on the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, the idea that he still was being briefed on information that isn't necessarily shared with the American public. When we do the debrief on this in the aftermath, whether or not he decides to try to fight for his seat in the Senate, gets expelled, resigns, what have you, Lisa, was this actually also a national security failure?
There's no question about that, Kaylee. I mean, it's the kind of thing that he did step aside, and I know that there were some surrenders that he made of his own power that he had in the committee when this first came through. But it's the kind of thing now that I think more than anything else, I mean, he has to see this not just for himself and for the district that he represents, but also so the integrity of the Democrat Party at this point. I mean, it adds into the broader narrative, the narrative about the president, the narrative about the Democrats and how they perceive these kinds of positions of power. It's not very helpful that it's happening right before Election Day. And it's the kind of thing that people will be paying attention to. And it adds another layer of challenge for the Democrats as it goes into Election Day.
Well, how would you message that if that was your job right now, Lisa? How does Joe Biden distance himself from this as he continues to criticize Donald Trump as a convicted felon?
I think the Senate leader did exactly what he needed to do. Leader Schumer did exactly what was necessary, and that was to call on him to step aside and step down. It takes the pressure off the president in order to have to message around that. It's definitely in Chuck Schumer's purview and in his power and really in his best interest to have Senator Menendez step down and step out of the Senate. And so that alone, I think, is really sort of good leadership on the side of Senator Schumer and the leadership in the Senate on the Democrat side in order to take that distraction out of the way, because certainly the timing on this is just terrible for them.
Well, Lisa, speaking of timing, of course, this news drops in the middle on day 2 of the Republican National Convention, knowing that you served as the RNC communications director in your former role. I would love to hear from you on just the tone shift that we're expecting to see, that we already have seen in day 1 of the convention, but that we could see from his vice presidential selection, J.D. Vance, from Donald Trump himself on Thursday in the aftermath of the events of recent days. Do you think the Republican Party has the discipline to stick to the unity, lower temperature rhetoric that they've said they will?
Oh, I definitely think they do, Kaylee. I think that this is actually for them, if they have that discipline and they can stay in that narrative, in that lane as it relates to what the messaging is coming out of Milwaukee. I think that it is incredibly strong and incredibly powerful. What's interesting, I saw the broadcast last night, and I know you talked a little bit about whether J.D. Vance allows for more of the MAGA messaging from his point of view as the vice presidential candidate, giving Donald Trump sort of a place to rise above and really sort of be sort of a leader and someone that people look to for that unity messaging. It's unlikely that it will happen for the next 4 months, but boy, if he could have that discipline, and it looks like the people around him are really encouraging that to me seems like a very powerful position for the Republican Party to be standing from beyond what the incidents of what had happened over the weekend.
All right, Lisa Camooso Miller, former RNC communications director and host of the Friday Reporter podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. And back with us around the table now here in Milwaukee, Rick Davis of Stonecourt Capital and Jeanne Zaino of Iona University, our political contributors here at Bloomberg. Just on this idea, Rick, of discipline, knowing that today is Make America Safe Again themed. That's what the second day of the convention is. Crime and the border are going to be the topics. This is something Joe raised with the governor of Alaska earlier. If there was ever a time that they were likely to break discipline, is it on these issues?
Look, I think that there'll probably be some shots, maybe not from the stage because that's pretty well orchestrated. And I doubt if anybody's going to see this as a, political advantage. But look, there could be a hot Senate race in New Jersey. Republicans have a newcomer on the ballot who was not a Trump candidate. And so the question is, do they want to do a shout out to that race, build up, his credentials? I think he's a real estate developer and, he could use some crime credentials. And so maybe they get him here. In fact, he may wind up, doing something from the stage between now and the end of the week because he's now in a primary that some people may think are going to be more competitive.
Well, as we consider some of the more interesting storylines around this Republican National Convention, one we have not mentioned yet was a meeting that took place yesterday between Donald Trump and RFK Jr. Is that going to be the big surprise tonight or tomorrow, an endorsement? Does he drop out of the race? What's this all about?
Yeah, I mean, we heard it was a lot about security and the idea that the Biden administration had not provided, or the Secret Service, the security that many folks thought he should get. He is getting that now. That has happened now. It would be just a fascinating turn of events if he was to endorse Donald Trump, to your point. I mean, that would be a big, big moment for Donald Trump if he was to step aside and do that. We don't know that yet. But even if he was just to speak at the convention, that would be quite interesting as well, because he does have a lot of appeal to many of the people in the room on a variety of issues. And when Donald Trump thought he may be a bit of a threat to him, he has taken him on. But to be here and at this moment and to potentially be talking to voters, that is a good sign for Donald Trump and the Republicans.
So I guess we'll see if RFK Jr. will speak at the convention. What we do know is that Nikki Haley will be speaking there tonight, Rick.
Yes.
If she has her eyes on 2028, what does she need to say to those gathered here in Milwaukee?
I endorse Donald Trump for president and will be voting for him, right? So, I mean, she's left that sort of open. She's endorsed him. She said she'd vote for him. But I think, that's the message she has to get. She has to become part of that movement if she has ambitions into the future of elected office. Look, she'll impress a lot of people tonight. Most of these delegates don't like her. They were against her when she ran against Donald Trump. I think the bigger question is, will they heckle her? How much booing will occur? I mean, Mitch McConnell got booed when he entered the hall last night. So I think the Trump people will try to control that floor, right? A lot of what you do, you'll see the guys with the little hats on run around, not just the red MAGA hats. Well, their job is to control the emotions, get them up when you need them and keep them quiet when you don't. And so this will be the first real test, I think, of whether or not they have control of that floor.
Well, we all remember what happened in 2016 when Ted Cruz went up there and said, vote your conscience. We'll see if we get something like that tonight. Rick Davis of Stonecourt Capital and Jeanne Zaino, Iona University, will be back with us for the late edition of Balance of Power, 5 p.m. Eastern Time, as we work our way up to the prime time portion of the RNC. We'll be joined here in Milwaukee by RNC co-chair Laura Trump, Alabama Senator Katie Britt, Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida. Kaylee, a lot to look forward to.
Indeed. So come back and see us at 5 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg TV and radio.